Please be seated. The court is now in session. Today, the Chamber continues the proceedings on key document presentation. There is the observation or responses to the key document presented by the co-prosecutors and the lead co-lawyers for civil parties by the defense team for Khieu Samphan in relation to security centers and internal approaches. Ms. Jie Su-Huang, please report the attendance of the parties and other individuals to today's proceedings. Grazie, Mr. President. For today's proceedings, all parties to this case are present. Mr. Nguyen Chi is present in the holding cell downstairs. He has waived his right to be present in the courtroom. The waiver has been delivered to the greffier, and we do not have any reserved witness today. Thank you. President, thank you. Ms. Jie Su-Huang, the Chamber now decides on the request by Nguyen Chi. The Chamber has received a waiver from Nguyen Chi, dated 16 August 2016, which states that due to his health, that is headache, back pain, he cannot sit or concentrate for long, and in order to effectively participate in future hearings, he requests to waive his rights to be present at the 16 August 2016 hearing. He advises that his counsel advised him about the consequence of this waiver, that in no way it can be construed as a waiver of his rights to be tried fairly or to challenge evidence presented to or admitted by this court at any time during this trial. Having seen the medical report of Nguyen Chi by the duty doctor for the accused at the ECCC, dated 16 August 2016, which states that Nguyen Chi has back pain and when he sits for long, and recommends that the Chamber shall grant him his request so that he can follow the proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs. Based on the above information and pursuant to Rule 81.5 of the ECCC internal rules, the Chamber grants Nguyen Chi his request to follow today's proceedings remotely from the holding cell downstairs via an audio-visual means. The Chamber instructs the AV unit personnel to link the proceedings to the room downstairs so that Nguyen Chi can follow. That applies for the whole day. The Chamber now hands the floors to the defense team for Khieu Samphan to make observations or to respond to the key document presented by the co-prosecutors and the lead co-lawyers for civil parties. Counsel, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I will begin my statement by asking the Chamber and the parties to excuse me, since the key documents hearing took place on Friday, and we had another hearing on Monday, and therefore I was not able to prepare a table as usual so that it would be easier to follow. But insofar as I'm only using the documents that were presented and submitted by the co-prosecutors, I do not foresee any difficulty. If we had known that there would have been no following witnesses, we could have used the weekend to do this, but things are as they are. The transcription section, who made themselves available during the weekend, the drafts are appreciated. I will begin by some general remarks. The presentation of documents as envisaged by the Chamber was for the co-prosecutors and the other parties to present the elements related to the security centers and purges. However, we did note that the presentation bled over into other segments of the trial, including specifically in relation to the armed conflict and a little bit on the supposed role and responsibility of the accused. So even though I will make some observations on some of those documents, the essence of that discussion I will reserve for another time when the Chamber will be dealing with those topics. Generally, I would like to recall the position of the Kira Sampan team, which is that we can only assign limited probative value to simple written statements which do not allow the parties to engage with the civil parties or the witnesses in the chamber. And this is the same. I refer you to the statements in other key documents hearings. Aside from this general remark on the documents submitted by the civil party lead co-lawyers, I will focus on certain documents presented by the prosecution. First of all, the national co-prosecutor submitted several documents on Oh Kan Seng, E3/240, which is a telegram of 7 June 1977. In this document, he spoke of the arrest of the Jarais. I would like to read to the Chamber this E3/240 document, 00282550 in French. In English, it is 00897667, and in Khmer the ARN is 00001266. And I would like to recall that in this telegram, there is a mention that a certain number of weapons were found in possessed by the people who were arrested, and I quote, finally, they said that they had been in the army from 2 to 10 years. They had on them an AK, 2 AR-15s, 2 pistols, and 3 U.S. grenades. End quote. This is an important element because in the presentation we had the impression that they were arrested because they were Jarai. It's a bit more complicated than that. Another document which was used by the co-prosecutor, the national co-prosecutor, were the statements of Cham Se, who is now deceased. So insofar as a certain number of these documents were presented in the hearing, I would like to draw the attention of the parties in the chamber to another portion of his declaration, E3/405. And in all of the languages, these are responses 9 and 11. And Cham Se explains how prisoners could have been freed. And here's what he says. So in answer 9, the last paragraph, after having observed the traces of these prisoners, we noticed that they had not committed any grave offenses and that they could have been corrected. So it was seen that we could free prisoners so that they could come back to the base. The next question. Who decided to release those prisoners after they had been re-educated? Answer 10. We did not have the right to release any of the prisoners. That depended on the hierarchy. This means that only the commander of the division, Saur Sarun, was able to make those decisions. Our only role was to re-educate them and to make reports according to the results of our assessments of those prisoners. Then if it was seen that their offenses were not as serious as what had been charged, we made reports to ask for the subsequent opinion and the decision from the higher level of the division. End quote. that is an interesting element, to understand the operation and the relation of Chamse with his division commander, Sarsaran. Concerning the other elements cited, and specifically the report of Sarsaran addressed to San Sen, I would like to simply indicate, specifically in E3 1164 and E360, addressed to San Sen, they list the various witnesses that we could have heard on these security centers and the military relation with those, showing that they are internal security centers and military centers. And now I would like to turn to Phnom Krau. The Deputy International Co-Prosecutor cited several passages of the work Purges in the Mondulkiri Islands of Sarah Colm and Surya Sim, which was published in 2009. So it's E3 1664. Because we don't have much on this work to find out how they proceeded to do their research, there's one thing that is certain, and that is that they have used many confessions as sources, and specifically a passage that was used by the co-prosecutor. We only have the ERN in English because there's no translation to other languages, so it's 00397615, and footnote 122 refers to a confession of So Kim, alias May. Another point on Phnom Krau. There were two records, 7103 of Wondos, WRIs, and WR 7702 of Sok El. And I would like to come back to two passages that were not cited by the prosecution on Ondos, so E3 7703. It is of interest to note that Ondos mentions the authorities of the Phnom Krau prisoner as being Lao at 004261116 in the French. The ERN in English is 00242171, and in Khmer 00236746. The question is, who was in charge of the Phnom Krau prison? Answer: Pai, Lang, and Talang. I don't know if they're still living or where they live. These three are all Lao in ethnicity. There were also other people at the higher levels, and I don't know them, but I had simply heard that there was Kampun, Ham, and Sopi, who were among the higher level cadres. End quote. On the topic of Sok L's document E3 7702, in this WRI I would like to quote a passage which is of interest regarding to the fact that, as the prosecution said, Sok El was a former police officer under the Lon Nol regime, and he notes that in Phnom Krau there were certain categories of prisoners, and that ERN in French it begins 00274825, in Khmer 00236-727, and in English 00239509, and it continues on to the next page. And here's what he says. Prisoners of first and second levels were meant to be re-educated at Phnom Khrao after they'd been brought to Phnom Penh. I was not beaten at Phnom Khrao, but I was told, "Uncle, when you were a police officer, did you beat people?" I answered him that I had never hurt others. And then another day when I was making a table, someone told me that I had been acquitted. Before allowing me to leave, I was brought to Ta Sopi's office so that he could give me instructions. He instructed me to not do as others had done and to go back and live with my family. End quote. This is an interesting passage because it's a former Lon Nol police officer who's speaking, and also because he mentions Ta Sopi in the hierarchy. Another point that was brought up by the prosecution on Phnom Khrao was the mention of telegrams, which the prosecution says demonstrates the role of the center in Sector 105, saying that it was proof that there was knowledge and control of the center, including the fate of the prisoners arrested. My first comment, and this is an element that we already mentioned in the context of the final conclusions of 02/2 or in the context of our appeal, this notion of center must not be a means of diluting the fact that when we're talking about a criminal trial, we need to talk about individual criminal responsibility because it's an extremely important element, and just talking about the center is not sufficient to establish the criminal responsibility of Mr. Khieu Samphan, specifically when we're raising everything that is secret and the repartition of various tasks. Having said that, I note that all the documents cited by the prosecution on this point in E3/1192, E3/1194, E3/1118, E3/1196, E3/160A, E3/1199, E3/877, E3/1204, E3/9288, E3/1020. They are all telegrams which were never addressed to Mr. Khieu Samphan, and we don't see him listed in a copy either. These are important elements to note, recalling once again that the notion of the center is quite nebulous and vague. It is not sufficient to establish individual responsibility. Another point that was brought up, as I spoke of earlier, that was brought up a bit prematurely, were the relations with Vietnam. It's true that it's not always easy to partition things, especially when we're bringing up pieces of evidence. But the fact that the prosecution is focusing on the fact that Kampuchea was at the origin of the attack on Vietnam while negotiations were underway, I would simply like to mention that if there were negotiations underway specifically in 1976 and 1977 between Democratic Kampuchea and Vietnam, it is because there were conflicts on the border. I would simply like to recall that things are always more complicated, and perhaps we need to explore this issue in more depth on the section on armed conflict. But it's important in regard to the telegrams that were submitted by the prosecution on this point to recall the witness statement of 27 January 2016 of Prom Sarat. This was between 11:10 and 11:17, where he talked about the arrest of 720 soldiers of Democratic Kampuchea by Vietnam forces on an island in Cambodian territory. So there were things that were accusations made against the two parties, both sides. Another point on this conflict with Vietnam, the prosecution specifically noted two records of minutes of the Standing Committee on E3/2017 of 11 March 76. And E3/218 of 26 March 76. And about the attacks, I would like to note E3/218, which is a report of YAR on the negotiations and exchanges with the Vietnamese delegation. And there are accusations of both sides. So on E3/218 in the ERN in French is 00334969. In English 00182653, and in Khmer 0000, so 5 zeros followed by 753. The sources from the Northeast, which are related to the Vietnamese Revolution and the conflict between the two countries, revealed much about the revolution. The high-level comrade Ya talked about these events since the liberation, specific locations, dates, and evidence of violations. Comrade Ya clarified that the Vietnamese comrades constantly talked about solidarity and threatened Cambodia by sending aircraft to strafe along the Mandalkiri border at O Dak Dong, Dak Hoop, and that they fired artillery nonstop. So what did solidarity mean then? End quote. The second passage is in the same page in French, and the following ERNs in English and Khmer, respectively. In English, 00182654, and in Khmer, 5 times 0, 5 zeros, followed by 754. And they mention the proposal that was made by Democratic Kampuchea. We proposed that they withdraw from Mui village, as well as Mungai and the Trangun village. This was our main desire. We truly wanted solidarity, but in order to have solidarity, the Vietnamese comrades needed to respect Kampuchean sovereignty. Up to this point, we had made many concessions. If those comrades continued to violate Kampuchean territory, there could be no solidarity. It could not work. We agreed for the people of Saum village to return to their village, and we agreed to set up sector liaison committees at the zone and region levels. End quote. At French ERN, this is the last passage that I will be quoting from this document, the French ERN 00334970. In Khmer, 5 zeros followed by 755, and in English 00182656. This is what is reported of what was said on the other side. Li Viong said on the border, in spite of several small incidents, there was nothing because we were friends in solidarity. If we had been enemies, even a small piece of land would have been impossible. Vietnam wants to propose to build a friendship border, a border of solidarity. Comrade Ya responded, Comrade, you say you want to build a border of friendship, but in fact, you have come to live in our territory. So how can we build this friendship border? Friendship must be based on the principle of mutual respect. End quote. So these are the pieces of evidence that I think everyone will come back to on the armed conflict segment, and it's important to recall that the telegrams which were cited by the prosecution are related to this situation and the different requirements on both sides in the context of negotiations. I will now come back to S21 and the documents that were submitted by the International Co-Prosecutor on this segment. First, just a small mention on a Chung X study, so document E404/2.1.3, and specifically the preface to this study and the assessment of the evaluation report, which is E404/4. I would like to recall that in your decision E404/4 in paragraph 7, you indicated that you intended to have Venu Vuti, who was responsible for the evaluation report of Chung Ek, to appear before the court so that they could speak of their methodology. This is an element which is extremely important because it's very technical, it's very scientific. And I think it will be very difficult to draw conclusions on this study without having the opportunity to interrogate this authority insofar as we have knowledge and possibility. We would also like to indicate that it doesn't seem in this scientific study that there was a study on the dating procedure of the elements examined, and this is something that will certainly need to be brought up with the scientist involved in the study. So the only comment that I can make at this stage, since the other comments will only be useful if Mr. Von Vuti would have appeared already before the chamber.
Earlier, I spoke about the issue of the premature nature of certain documents, in particular documents linked with the responsibility of the accused persons. And the prosecution, as it has done for the 6th time, replayed a video segment of the documentary film Facing Genocide, document E109/2/3R. And as I said, it's the 6th time that this segment has been used. And I'd like to remind you that at the hearing of 31 January 2013, this segment was used, as well as at the hearing of 5 February 2013, during a key document hearing as well as at the hearing of 18 October 2013 during the final statements of the prosecution, as well as at the beginning of case 02/2 at the hearing of 7 October 2014. So we are aware that the prosecution enjoys screening this segment, and I'd like to replace the context of this documentary film. That is to say that this is a documentary that was shot at a date prior to Kieu-Sampan's arrest, obviously, and that is prior, of course, to Kieu-Sampan's access to the documents that made up his investigation that he was not aware of before, of course. And this is an important element when we analyze Kieu-Sampan's writings, because he has a specific tendency of basing himself on things he read in certain books. So before I return to this specific point, I would like to quote a segment from the book Recent History of Cambodia and my recent stance, document E3318, that was quoted partially by the prosecution. I'd like to refer you here to French ERN 00595513, Khmer ERN 00103 891 and English ERN 00103794. So the prosecution mentioned the first part that I'd like to mention again. And this is what we can read, and I'd like to remind you that this book dates back to 2004. Towards the middle of 1978, we were hearing about the massive arrests and the atrocities that were committed in Prévihir province. It was my wife in tears who told me the account of the atrocities that were committed against her brothers and relatives, who were among many, many innocent victims there. End of quote, free translation. Here, this was the quote such as it was made or presented, correctly interpreted by the prosecution. The second part that was omitted by the prosecution, but back then, the liberation of the victims and the arrest of the secretary of the party of the province led us to believe that this was only an isolated case. End of quote. So it's important, therefore, to focus on the totality of this quote. And before I turn to other segments, and in particular Que Sont Paul's interviews with Steve Heder, one of the arguments presented by the prosecution was that Que Sont Paul could not claim to ignore what was happening because according to list E390/3 of that was drafted by the co-investigating judges, there were a certain number of people who were arrested and who had worked in the state warehouses at the Ministry of Commerce. So therefore aspects of the regime that fell under Que Sont Paul's authority. So this is a point, of course, that we're going to be dealing with in a more complete way when we will be speaking about the supposed role and the supposed responsibility of the defendants. But such a general statement coming from the prosecution saying that there were people who were from the Ministry of Commerce who have been arrested does not allow us to claim that Que Sont Paul had any kind of responsibility whatsoever in the arrest of these people, nor in the arrest process of these people, nor that he was aware of these arrests that occurred in various departments which it was not sure that he managed. So this is first comment that I wanted to make now. Of course, I suppose that the issue will come up again when we will be dealing with responsibility. So right now it's a little bit premature, I agree. Now, regarding a document or an article from Steve Heder, Pol Pot, and Que Sont Paul that was used by the International Co-Prosecutor, document E3/3169. I first would like to note that this is an article that dates back to 1991, and it's important to understand this when we look at Steve Heder's work. We know that we know the different functions he held. We know how his research developed. So noting that this article was published in 1991 is important because there are elements that were not yet made available to him. And so it will be interesting to be able to question him a posteriori with the knowledge he garnered afterwards when he worked with the co-investigating judges as well as with the prosecution and also as a researcher. In any case, aside from the fact that this document dates back to 1991, I would like to remind you that, or to remind you that the Chamber reminded us that confessions cannot be used as evidence in a criminal trial such as this one, especially at this juncture in an international court. And the segment that was used by the prosecution, so this was at ERN, French ERN 0072290, Khmer ERN 00711 and English 0002760. And you will note that this footnote 60, which is at the end of this paragraph, mentions Tuchet's convention alias C. So this is an element that is important to note. Another point that I would like to underscore, and I spoke about this a little bit earlier when I was speaking about the issue of the writings and Kesampan's interviews after the regime, reminding you that it's useful to note that most of the elements that the prosecution presented in relation to Kesampan are elements that date from the post-decay period, in particular the interviews, and I would like to bring up segments that were not mentioned by the prosecution regarding, in particular, interviews with Steve Heder. So interviews that are not dated E3/4035 and E3/4032. But even though they're not dated, we will see, or we can understand clearly that they date from the period after Democratic Kampuchea, and even way after the first interview that Steve Heder had with Kesampan, which was back in 1980. And I'd like to remind the Chamber and the parties that this was at the hearing of 18 July 2013, so document E1/226.1 at around 10:21. And Heder then reminded us that the first time he spoke with Kesampan was following a press conference that was organized by the people in charge of DK back then. And it is following this press conference that he spoke with Kesampan and Yang Sari, and with Kesampan for the first time. Then we have this document E3/4032, which is an interview that was granted afterwards in 1980. And it's interesting to note that Kesampan supports his statements and his analysis on what he read and that are post-decay. And since these are transcripts of interviews, I'd like to refer you to the beginning of this transcript in all three languages, 0 minutes, therefore 0, 0, 0, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. And this is what he says, this is what Kesampan said. These struggles continued until the end of the war in 1975. This is what Ben Kiernan says in the Pol Pot regime, page 65. And I considered the different discoveries of this foreign researcher as the first element and regarding Pol Pot. That's the end of, that's a point that's extremely important, because often when quotes from Kesampan are cut or edited, we do not see on what he bases his statements, but contrary to what the prosecution says when it presents pieces of his statements, most of these statements are comments based on elements he read elsewhere. We find this point as well at 0 minutes, 0 hours, 2 minutes and 24 seconds in the same document. And this is what Kesampan says again, still speaking about the chit-chat with Pol Pot that was brought up by the prosecution. And it was through this mean that he was aware that the researcher what the researcher discovered thanks to his interviews with T. Samon and others. On the contrary, Mr. Pol Pot did not interview Mr. T. Samon. Maybe he spoke with T. Samon. I don't know exactly.
President, Council, please read the names again. The interpreter could not follow them.
I have the impression that there's a technical problem. I will start again because I went a bit too fast. Corrects interpreter. So it's document E3/4032. It's a transcript of an interview, and it's minuted. So it's at minute 2 minutes and 24 seconds. And let me read again. Through this way, he was aware of what the researcher discovered thanks to the interviews of Thea Samon. Maybe I'm not pronouncing it very well, so let me spell it out for the interpreters. T-E-A, then S-A-M-O-N. T. Samon and others. On the contrary, Mr. Pol Pot did not interview Mr. Thea Samon. Maybe he spoke with him. I don't know. End of quote, free translation. Another segment that's important and interesting is at 6 minutes and 18 seconds, still in the same document. And this is what Que Son Pan said. Then Mr. Pol Pot added, we, the Standing Committee, must pay attention. I also know these words of Mr. Pol Pot. I learned them thanks to Mr. Ben Kiernan in his book, The Pol Pot Regime, at page 101. This is what Mr. Ben Kiernan wrote, and that's it. End of quote. Partially free translation. So, this is an important element, and I also quote another transcript of an interview, E3/4035. So this is again the very beginning of the transcription, so at 000000, and this is what Mr. Que Son Pan says. I wanted finally to speak about Pol Pot's leadership style, which I witnessed through my research and through Philip Short's words, who qualified him specifically as a shrewd leader. And Ben Kiernan also underscored this point without mentioning his leadership in general. He did appreciate his wonderful force of persuasion, thanks to which he was able to convince Sao Pim to join the armed struggle. End of quote, partially free translation. So aside from the fact that these are interpretations from Que Son Pan based on what he read in Philip Short and Ben Kiernan, it's interesting to know that after DK, Que Son Pan did a lot of research on elements he did not know, and he said this again before this chamber, saying that there are many, many things that he only learnt in this courtroom. So this is an important element to note, and it's an important element also to place his writings and the excerpts of his writings in the proper context. And it's even more so important to remind this aspect that the prosecution, when it spoke then about Nunchea's statements regarding Que Son Pan, also omitted a certain number of elements, which I'd like to remind you of here, and this will be my last point. I, of course, will not make lengthy observations on Nunchea's statements. That's not my role. But regarding what was quoted concerning Que Son Pan, I would like to put things back in the proper context. It's not the first time that the prosecution mentions the conversation between Duc and Nunchea regarding a confession in which Que Son Pan's name was apparently mentioned. This is a recurring argument that the prosecution uses. So we find this point in Behind the Killing Fields, a book by Tut Sombat, document E3/4202. And this segment quoted by the international co-prosecutor was not complete. He spoke about this incident with Duic, and it's at French ERN 00849413. English 00757520. And Khmer ERN 00858306 on to the following page. And what's interesting here is that after this conversation with Duic, Nunchea apparently said to Tet Sambat that he did not speak about this to Khieu Samphan, and this is what we can see in the book, and I quote, Duik remained silent and no longer spoke to Nunchea about Khieu Samphan. Nunchea said nothing to anyone about the charges. And here he's quoted, I never spoke to Khieu Samphan about this because I did not believe that it was useful to do so, he said, end of quote, free translation. So this is an element that's important because the international co-prosecutor also spoke about a passage from Tet Samphan's book during which, or in which Nunchea said that Pol Pot and Nunchea and Khieu Samphan often ate meals together, implying therefore because that everything was said then. That's not what Nunchea said in his interviews with Tet Sambat. And this is the point I would like to finish with in the same book again, E3/4202, French ERN 00757. Correct, that was English. French ERN 0084947. Khmer 00858328. And let me read out the totality of the paragraph so that everything is placed in its proper context. Sihanouk was not the only one who only had a facade position. Many leaders with an important position within the government, such as Khieu Samphan and Ieng Sary, were not involved in crucial decisions. Huyen, Von Vet, and other ministers did not belong either to the circle of those who were initiated. Power was linked to the importance of the duties within the Communist Party, contrary to the role played within the government. Nunchea was not deputy prime minister, nor was he at the head of a ministry, and his function as the deputy secretary of the CPK did not give him enormous powers. He elaborated a great number of policies of the parties, and in the ruling circles of the party, Ankar, they were often associated with brothers number 1 and 2. That is Tet Sambat's analysis. Now, we can look at what Nunchea says. Many policies among the most touchy ones in the regime were discussed between Pol Pot and Nunchea and no one else. Nunchea indicated that Ieng Sary, and especially Khieu Samphan, were informed neither of the purges of those in charge nor of other definitions that defined the regime. End of quote. So it's important to understand this because despite the meals they shared, there is information that was not shared with Khieu Samphan. So I am done with my observations, and I'd like to remind you that, of course, regarding the role and responsibilities of the defendants, these are issues that will be dealt with in more depth when that will be the time to deal with that segment.
President, it is now time for the adjournment, and the chamber will resume its hearing tomorrow on 17 August 2016 at 9 a.m. President, because of technical matter, the chamber is now taking